My name is Jacob Thundercloud, 29 years old. Born and raised in the flatlands of Nebraska, I've always been a man of simple tastes. I make my living as a freelance photographer specializing in landscapes. My work takes me to remote locations across the country where I find solace in nature's quiet beauty. It was during one of these trips that I found myself in Cascade Falls, South Dakota. Cascade Falls isn't on any tourist map. It's a small, forgotten town nestled in the Black Hills, a place where time seems to stand still. I arrived there on a late afternoon, my old Ford pickup rumbling into town on a whim and a half-tank of gas. The sun hung low, casting long shadows over the single street that cut through town. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and the promise of an early winter. I parked near the only diner in town, a modest establishment called Betty's Place. The windows were fogged with the warmth of dinner preparations, and the aroma of home-cooked meals wafted through the air. I walked in, feeling the eyes of the few patrons follow me as I took a seat at the counter. A middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a weary smile. "Just passing through," I replied. "Name's Morris." "Nice to meet you, Morris. I'm Betty. What brings you to Cascade Falls?" "I'm a photographer. Came to see what the area has to offer." Betty nodded, her smile widening. "Well, you won't find much in town, but the woods are something else. Just be careful. Folks around here say the woods aren't safe after dark." "Why's that?" I asked, curiosity piqued. "People go missing sometimes. Hunters, hikers. Nobody knows why, but it's enough to keep most folks indoors after sunset." I thanked her for the advice, ordered a coffee, and settled in to plan my shoot for the next day. As I sipped my coffee, a man at the end of the counter struck up a conversation. "You should check out Devil's Gulch," he said. His name was Clint, a local farmer. "It's about 10 miles north of here. Beautiful place, but eerie. Folks don't go there much anymore." "Why's that?" Clint shrugged. "Stories, mostly. Strange noises. Shadows that move when they shouldn't. But if you're looking for something different, it's worth a look." The next morning, I set out for Devil's Gulch. The drive was uneventful, the landscape gradually transforming from rolling plains to dense forest. I parked my truck at the entrance to a narrow trail and began my hike, camera slung over my shoulder. The woods were silent, save for the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of a bird. The further I ventured, the thicker the trees grew, their branches intertwining overhead to form a natural canopy. Some light filtered through in dappled patterns, casting an ethereal glow on the forest floor. As I neared Devil's Gulch, the air grew colder. A shiver ran through me, and I pulled my jacket tighter. The path narrowed, flanked by towering pines that seemed to close in around me. I paused to take a few shots, the click of my camera the only sound in the stillness. Suddenly, a low, guttural sound echoed through the trees. My heart raced as I scanned the area, but I saw nothing. Telling myself it was just an animal, I pressed on, though my senses were now on high alert. I reached the edge of the gulch, a deep ravine with sheer rock walls and a trickling stream at the bottom. It was breathtaking in its wild beauty, but there was an unsettling quality to it, as if the very air was charged with an unseen presence. I set up my tripod, focusing on the rugged landscape. Minutes turned into hours as I lost myself in my work, but the sun's descent reminded me of Betty's warning. I packed up and started back, the forest growing darker with each passing moment. The path seemed to twist and turn in ways I didn't remember, and an uneasy feeling settled in my gut. Then I heard it again, a sound like something heavy moving through the underbrush. I quickened my pace, glancing over my shoulder every few steps. My breath came in short bursts, the cold air biting at my lungs. I stumbled on a root and went down hard, my camera skidding away. As I scrambled to my feet, I caught a glimpse of something through the trees. It was large, moving with a deliberate, almost predatory grace. Panic surged through me, and I broke into a run, abandoning my camera. Branches slapped against my face, and the ground seemed to rise up to meet me with every step. I burst into a small clearing, gasping for breath. There was no sign of my pursuer, but the forest was now eerily silent. No birds, no wind, just an oppressive stillness. I forced myself to keep moving, every nerve screaming for me to get out. The sound came again, closer this time. I didn't dare look back. My only thought was to reach my truck and get the hell out of there. I crashed through the underbrush, adrenaline fueling my frantic escape. When I finally broke free of the trees and saw my truck, a wave of relief washed over me. I fumbled for my keys, hands shaking, and practically threw myself inside. The engine roared to life, and I tore down the dirt road, not daring to slow down until the forest was a distant memory. I pulled into the diner's parking lot, my heart still pounding. Betty looked up in surprise as I stumbled inside. "Are you all right, Morris?" she asked, concern etched on her face. Something out there." I gasped. "Something's not right in those woods." Clint, who had been sitting at the counter, walked over. "What did you see?" "I don't know," I admitted. "But it's real. It's dangerous." The locals exchanged uneasy glances. Betty poured me a coffee, her hand trembling slightly. "You're not the first to come back with stories like that," she said softly. "But no one's ever been able to explain it." I stayed in town that night, unable to shake the feeling of being watched. The next day, I went back to retrieve my camera, armed with the hunting knife I'd borrowed from Clint. The forest seemed less threatening in the daylight, but I couldn't ignore the sense of dread that hung over me. I found my camera near the clearing, surprisingly intact. As I picked it up, I noticed something on the ground, large, deep impressions that looked like footprints, but not quite human. I took a few photos and hurried back to my truck, eager to leave the woods behind. Back in town, I developed the photos, hoping to find some explanation for what I'd experienced. The footprints were unlike anything I'd seen before, and the memory of that shadowy figure haunted me. A few days later, I left Cascade Falls, but the events of that day stayed with me. I couldn't forget the fear, the feeling of being hunted. The locals continued to speak in hushed tones about the disappearances, but no one ever found any answers. I never returned to Devil's Gulch. My work took me to other places, other landscapes, but the memory of that day lingered at the edges of my mind. Sometimes, when I'm alone in the quiet of the wilderness, I think about what might still be out there, hidden in the depths of those ancient woods. Years passed, and I settled into a routine, but every so often, I'd come across a news article about a missing person near Cascade Falls. The details were always vague, the outcomes uncertain, and I'd remember the sound, the shadow, and the overwhelming sense of dread. One night, as I was developing some photos in my dark room, there was a knock at the door. It was Clint, older and more haggard than I remembered. He tracked me down, said he needed to talk. "People are still disappearing," he said, eyes haunted. "And it's getting worse. Whatever's out there, it's not done." I listened as he recounted the latest incidents, the fear in his voice palpable. It was clear that the thing in the woods hadn't stopped its hunt, and the town was living in a state of perpetual fear. Clint urged me to come back, to help document the evidence, to raise awareness. Part of me wanted to refuse, to keep the past buried, but another part knew I couldn't ignore it. The truth needed to be uncovered for the sake of those still at risk. So I agreed. I packed my gear, steeling myself for a return to the place that had haunted my dreams for so long. This time, I was determined to find answers, no matter the cost. We arrived in Cascade Falls just as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the town. The locals greeted us with a mix of hope and fear, and I couldn't help but feel the weight of their unspoken expectations. That night, Clint and I set out for Devil's Gulch, armed with cameras, flashlights, and a renewed sense of purpose. The forest welcomed us with its familiar, unsettling silence, and as we ventured deeper, the sense of dread returned. We reached the gulch and set up our equipment, determined to document whatever we found. And then, just as before, we heard it. the sound of something moving through the trees, closer and closer. This time we were ready, cameras rolling, flashlights cutting through the darkness. The figure emerged from the shadows, and I felt a chill run through me. It was unlike anything I'd ever seen, a grotesque, animalistic form that defied explanation. And the creature snarled, a guttural, inhuman sound that sent shivers down my spine. We stood our ground, determined to capture proof. The creature lunged, and in the chaos that followed, Clint was knocked to the ground. I swung my flashlight, connecting with the creature's head, buying us a moment of reprieve. We fled through the forest, the creature in pursuit. The underbrush tore at our clothes, the darkness disorienting us at every turn. But we didn't stop, driven by sheer survival instinct. We burst into the clearing, the creature still behind us. Clint stumbled, and I turned to help him, but the creature was too fast. It reached him first, and I could do nothing but watch in horror as it dragged him into the darkness. I ran, my heart pounding, tears streaming down my face. I didn't stop until I reached the truck, throwing myself inside and speeding back to town. The aftermath was a blur. I told the authorities what happened, showed them the footage we'd captured. They organized a search party, but Clint was never found. The town of Cascade Falls remains shrouded in mystery, its residents living in fear of the unknown. I returned to my life, but the events of that night changed me forever. The creature still haunts my dreams, a reminder of the darkness that lurks in the forgotten corners of our world. And though I've tried to move on, I know that some things can never be forgotten. The truth of Devil's Gulch remains elusive, a mystery that may never be solved. But I continue my work, driven by the need to uncover the hidden stories of our world, no matter how terrifying they may be. I grew up on an acreage in a rough bush area in northern British Columbia. We worked really hard and were often in close proximity to all kinds of wildlife. I got my first rifle when I was 9 years old and hunted from that point on until recently. This happened to me 50 years ago when I was 14. I was in the habit of jumping on my motorbike, riding 20 miles further back from the head of the road where we lived into the bush, on old logging roads, and then hiking 45 minutes through dense bush to my favorite fishing spot, Brewster Lake. I would like to go alone with just my dog. He always knew where I was going and would trot his way out by himself, usually showing up about 30 minutes after I got there. We would usually spend 2 or 3 days there when we went. I didn't pack a lot of gear. My .22, hunting knife, sleeping bag, matches, fishing gear, frying pan, and sometimes I would even remember to bring the salt and pepper since I never ever brought food in with me. Either I'd head back home and I couldn't stomach any more fish, or if it was too wet, as I also never had a tent. I just slept under the stars of my sleeping bag. I had never even heard of Bigfoot. On this particular trip, it was in late August 1973, as mentioned. I didn't have a tent, just my dog and I. During my second night sleeping out under the stars at around 2 to 3 a.m., I woke to the sound of something very large moving through the woods on 2 legs, about 25 or 30 feet off to my right on the edge of the brush. I couldn't see anything because my fire was long out and it was overcast. I glanced around to see where my dog was. He was usually nearby me, but was nowhere to be seen. My .22 was just off to my left, and I had my hunting knife beside me inside the sleeping bag. I didn't think the .22 was going to be much help in the event of a big animal attack anyhow, so I left it where it was and slipped my knife out of its sheath inside my sleeping bag. I thought it must be a bear because what else could it be? I lay still, hoping that whatever it was would leave me alone and move on, but that wasn't in the cards. I was camping on a small rocky point between the ledge of the brush and the lake. It's about 30 feet wide. I was about in the middle between the lake edge and the bush. My feet were pointed mostly toward the lake at an angle with my head facing mostly toward the woods. I heard this thing moving around to the back of me. It came out of the brush and slowly moved up directly behind my head. As this was happening, I was preparing for the fight I thought was surely coming. So in my sleeping bag, I slowly shrugged my shoulders up as close to my ears as possible and moved my left hand and arm up over my throat to protect my neck. My right hand was on my chest with my knife tightly gripped and ready to go if something was going to eat me for lunch. It might be a cheap lunch, but I was going to make sure it wasn't going to be a free lunch. I was sleeping with my head mostly covered by the top of my sleeping bag with just my eyes, nose, and mouth exposed to the night because of all the mosquitoes. Even though I was on mostly rock, I could feel the footsteps. I've never heard anything breathe so loudly. If you breathed in and out as long and hard as you could in an exaggerated way, it still wouldn't even come close. I swear I could feel the breath. I tell you, I was fully expecting I was going to get my face chomped. I remember thinking to myself, what the hell kind of bear is this? It stopped about 3 feet behind my head, and that's when the smell hit me. I mean, it was bad. I can't even describe it, and in spite of my best intentions to be quiet, lay still, and hope it didn't mess with me, I couldn't help gagging and coughing. Now this part is very hard to explain, and I don't give a crap if people believe me or not. But at that point I clearly heard a calm voice in my head telling me that I had nothing to worry about. I was perfectly safe and nothing was going to hurt me. I should relax and go back to sleep, and right then I was overcome with a sense of calm and feeling extremely tired. I remember thinking to myself, what the hell? How can I go to sleep at a time like this? My visitor turned and started walking away from me, and I fell right to sleep before it was even gone. I don't remember it leaving. I slept well and woke up at first light about 6 a.m. to a cow moose up to its mid-belly in the water feeding on the lake bottom, not 25 feet from where I was lying, and my dog was back beside me. This messed with my head for a long time because it was not at all like a bear. It was definitely walking on 2 legs, and the odor was unlike anything I've ever smelled. I couldn't make sense of it. I never talked to anyone about this until years later when I told my grown sons. I don't know that they believed me, and I can't say I blame them, but at least they had the good sense to keep that to themselves. I'm from the era when if someone said they didn't believe you, that's the same as them calling you a liar. And those are fighting with words. In spite of that, the experience never deterred me in the least from going back out and camping alone in the same area. My name is Dominic Mountain Bear, and I am 27 years old, and this happened to me in 1992. It was summer, the kind of humid heat that made everything feel heavy and slow. I was living in a small town in southern Mississippi, working odd jobs and trying to figure out what to do with my life. I grew up on the reservation in Oklahoma, but after my folks passed, I drifted south, ending up in places that seemed as lost as I felt. On the weekends, I'd head out to the woods. It was peaceful, and it reminded me of home. One Friday, I convinced my buddy Zane Reddick to come along. Zane was a mechanic, solid guy, always up for an adventure. We packed up my old Jeep with a tent, some fishing gear, and a cooler full of beer. We aimed for the Pascagoula River Wildlife Management Area, a sprawling stretch of swamp and forest that few dared to venture deep into. We set up camp near a bend in the river. It was perfect. Tall cypress trees surrounded us, and the water was calm and inviting. We spent the first day fishing and just shooting the breeze. It felt good to unwind, to let the worries of the world slip away with the current. As the sun dipped below the horizon, we built a fire and settled in for the night. The sounds of the swamp took over. Crickets, frogs, the occasional splash of a fish. It was peaceful, almost hypnotic. "Ethan, you ever hear about the Witch of the Pascagoula?" Zane asked, staring into the flames. "Nah, can't say I have." "What's the story?" "Some old local legend. They say a witch lived out here long ago, got run off by the townsfolk, but she never left. Still roams the swamp, looking for revenge." I chuckled. "Sounds like a load of bull to me." "Yeah, probably," Zane said, but his eyes darted around the dark trees as if expecting something to emerge. That night I woke up to a noise outside the tent. It wasn't the usual sounds of the swamp, it was something else. Something that didn't belong. I nudged Zane awake. Hey, you hear that? What? No, go back to sleep, man. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I unzipped the tent and stepped outside. The fire had died down to embers, casting just enough light to see the immediate area. There was nothing there, just the trees and the river. I figured it was an animal and crawled back into the tent. The next day, we hiked deeper into the woods. Zane wanted to find an old hunting cabin his uncle had told him about. Said it was abandoned, but still in good shape. We walked for miles, the trees closing in around us, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and decay. We found the cabin around midday. It was small, barely more than a shack, but it was solid. We poked around inside, finding nothing but dust and cobwebs. Think we should stay here tonight? Zane asked. Sure, why not? Beats hiking back to camp in the dark. We spent the afternoon exploring the area. There was an old well nearby, overgrown and half hidden by brush. Zane tried to see if there was any water left, but the bucket came up dry. As night fell, a sense of unease settled over me. It was the same feeling I'd had the night before. We lit a fire in the cabin's old stove and sat down to eat. You think there's really anything to that witch story? Zane asked, breaking the silence. I doubt it, just a tale to scare kids. But as I said it, couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I found myself glancing at the door, half expecting someone or something to burst in. We turned in early, both of us too tired to stay up, but sleep didn't come easy. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle of the leaves outside set my nerves on edge. At some point, exhaustion took over and I drifted off. I woke to a scream, Zane's scream. I bolted upright, my heart pounding. He was thrashing in his sleeping bag, eyes wide with terror. Zane, what the hell's wrong? He didn't answer, just kept screaming, pointing at the door. I turned to look, and for a second I saw it. A shadow, darker than the night, with eyes that glowed like embers. Then it was gone, and Zane was silent, unconscious. I dragged him outside, my mind racing. What had I seen? What was happening? I tried to wake Zane, but he was out cold. I checked for a pulse, relieved to find it strong and steady. With Zane out, I had no choice but to keep watch. I sat by the fire, clutching a stick for protection, though I knew it was useless. The night stretched on, every sound amplified, every shadow a potential threat. Zane woke at dawn, groggy and confused. He didn't remember anything, just a feeling of dread. We need to get out of here, I said. Yeah, I think you're right. We packed up and started back toward the jeep. The woods seemed different now, more oppressive. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves set my nerves on edge. Halfway back, we came across a clearing we hadn't seen before. In the center was a pile of rocks, arranged in a circle. It looked old, ancient even. Zane stepped closer, curious. Don't touch it, I warned. Why not? It's just rocks. But I had a bad feeling, a sense that this place was connected to what we'd seen. We skirted the clearing and kept moving, quickening our pace. We reached the jeep by midday. As we loaded our gear, I noticed something on the ground, footprints, large and misshapen, leading away from our camp. We need to go. Now, I said. We climbed in and took off, the engine's roar a welcome sound. As we sped away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something chasing us. But there was nothing, just the empty road. We didn't talk much on the drive back to town. What was there to say? We'd seen something we couldn't explain, something that didn't belong in our world. A week later, I was at the bar nursing a beer when Zane walked in. He looked rough, like he hadn't slept in days. Ethan, we need to talk. What's up? I've been having nightmares about that night, about the cabin. I nodded. Me too. I did some digging, talked to some old-timers. They say there's something out there, something ancient. They call it the Hantak. The Hantak? Yeah, some kind of spirit or creature. They say it's been here longer than any of us, and it doesn't like intruders. Great, I muttered. So what do we do? Stay away from the swamp for starters, and maybe, just maybe, we keep this to ourselves. Agreed. We finished our beers in silence, the weight of what we'd seen settling over us. We didn't go back to the swamp, and we didn't talk about it again. But sometimes, late at night, I think about those glowing eyes and the feeling of being watched, and I wonder if the Hontak is still out there, waiting. Years passed, and the memory of that night faded, though it never disappeared completely. I moved on with my life, got a steady job at a construction company, met a girl named Lisa, and tried to leave the past behind. But Zane wasn't so lucky. He couldn't shake the nightmares, couldn't forget what we'd seen. One evening, I got a call from Lisa. She sounded worried. Ethan, Zane's missing. His sister said he didn't come home last night. Did he say where he was going? No, but I think he went back to the swamp. Damn it, I muttered. I'll find him. I grabbed my keys and drove out to the Pascagoula River Wildlife Management Area. The place looked the same, but it felt different, like the shadows were deeper, the air heavier. I followed the old path to our campsite, my heart pounding in my chest. I found Zane's truck parked near the river. The door was open and his gear was scattered around, but there was no sign of him. I called out his name, but the only response was the echo of my own voice. Then I saw the footprints, the same large misshapen prints we'd seen before. Leading away from the truck and into the woods, I grabbed a flashlight and followed them, my mind racing with memories of that night. The trail led me to the clearing with the circle of rocks. In the center was Zane, lying motionless. I rushed to his side, fearing the worst, but he was alive, though barely conscious. Zane, what happened? He opened his eyes, his voice a whisper. The Hontak. It's real. I saw it. Need to get out of here, I said, lifting him to his feet. As we stumbled back toward the truck, I felt a presence behind us, a cold, malevolent force. I didn't dare look back, just focused on getting Zane to safety. We made it to the truck, and I drove like a madman, the sense of dread lifting only when we were miles away. Zane didn't say much, just stared out the window, lost in thought. Back in town, we took Zane to the hospital. He was dehydrated and exhausted, but otherwise fine. The doctors couldn't explain it, and we didn't try to. We never spoke of the Hontak again. But the experience changed us. Zane moved away, seeking a fresh start in a new town. I stayed, but I never went back to the swamp. Some things are better left alone, some mysteries unsolved. Life went on, but the memory lingered, a reminder of the thin line between the known and the unknown. And sometimes late at night, I still think about those glowing eyes and the feeling of being watched. The Hontak is out there somewhere, a dark shadow in the heart of the swamp, waiting. My name is Isaiah Oakenhart, and I am 39 years old, and this happened to me a few years back. I'm a park ranger at Fort Ross State Historic Park, a small patch of land on the northern coast of California. I've always loved the outdoors, the solitude, and the way nature demands your respect. I never thought my job could become something out of a nightmare, but here we are. Let me set the scene for you. I was always the kind of guy who liked being out in the wild more than being around people. My dad was a forest ranger too, so you could say it runs in the family. The old man taught me everything, how to track, how to read the weather, and how to navigate the dense forests that were our backyard. Maybe I was too good at it, or maybe I should have stuck to the usual patrol routes. But I always liked exploring the less traveled areas of the park. Little did I know that curiosity would lead me somewhere I wished I'd never found. It was a Tuesday, I think. I was patrolling the eastern edge of the park, near an area known for its rough terrain and thick brush. There's not much out there, just old logging trails and the occasional hiker who gets turned around. My buddy, Chet Nolan, was with me that day. Chet's a good guy, solid ranger, a bit of a joker. We spent most of the day bantering, keeping our spirits up as we hiked through the dense forest. Around mid-afternoon, we stumbled upon something odd. It was an old campsite, looked like it hadn't been used in years. There was a rusted-out fire ring, some decaying camping gear half buried in the dirt. Chet and I figured we'd take a break, maybe see if we could piece together who might have left it there. We sat down and started flipping through the journal. It was filled with the usual stuff, notes about hikes, sketches of the landscape, and then it took a darker turn. The later entries were frantic, almost incoherent, talking about strange noises in the night, shadows moving between the trees, and something watching from the darkness. It was the kind of stuff that would give anyone the creeps, but we shrugged it off as someone's overactive imagination. We decided to head back, but as we stood up, Chet noticed something sticking out of the ground a few yards away. It was a metal box, old and rusty. We dug it out, and inside we found a bunch of old photos, more journals, and a map. The photos were the worst blurry images of what looked like people, but distorted, like they were half hidden in shadows. The map marked a spot deeper into the forest, far off any known trails. "Want to check it out?" Chet asked half-jokingly. We both knew it was a bad idea, but there was something about that map that drew us in. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the thrill of uncovering a mystery, but we decided to go for it. I radioed back to base, let them know we'd be out of contact for a bit. We packed up and headed deeper into the forest. The further we went, the quieter it got. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the sound of our footsteps crunching on the underbrush. After a couple of hours, we found the spot marked on the map. There was nothing there, just trees and more trees. We were about to turn back when we heard it, a low rhythmic sound, like someone beating a drum slowly and steadily. It was coming from somewhere close by, so we followed it. We found an old cabin hidden away in a small clearing. It looked abandoned, but the sound was definitely coming from inside. The door was ajar, and Chet, always the brave one, decided to peek in. "Hey Avery, you gotta see this," he called out. I joined him, and what we saw made my blood run cold. The cabin was filled with weird symbols carved into the walls and floors, strange totems made of sticks and bones hanging from the ceiling, and in the center, an old wooden table with a large, dusty book. The drumming sound was louder now, almost deafening. It seemed to be coming from beneath the floorboards. Chet, ever the adventurer, decided to investigate further. He found a trapdoor hidden under a rug. Against my better judgment, we opened it and climbed down into the darkness. The air was cold and damp, and the smell was unbearable, like something rotting. We followed a narrow passageway that led to a larger chamber. That's where we saw it. The chamber was filled with bones, animal and human, and in the center a large stone altar with more of those strange symbols. The drumming sound was coming from a small, grotesque figure carved out of wood and bone sitting on the altar. Its eyes seemed to follow us as we moved around the room. "This is messed up, man," Chet said, his voice shaking. "We should get out of here." I agreed. We turned to leave, but then we heard a noise behind us, like something dragging across the floor. We spun around, and there it was, a creature unlike anything I'd ever seen. It was tall and gaunt, with elongated limbs and pale, almost translucent skin. Its eyes were black pits, and its mouth was filled with sharp, jagged teeth. We froze, too scared to move. The creature stared at us for what felt like an eternity, and then it lunged at Chet. He screamed, tried to fight it off, but it was too strong. I watched in horror as it tore into him, blood spraying everywhere. I wanted to help him, but I was paralyzed with fear. Finally, my instincts kicked in, and I ran. I ran like I'd never run before, not looking back, just focusing on getting out of that hellish place. I burst out of the cabin, heart pounding, lungs burning. I could still hear Chet's screams echoing in my ears. I didn't stop running until I reached the park's main trail. I radioed for help, but all I could manage to say was that Chet was gone, and something had attacked us. It took the rangers a while to find the cabin, By the time they got there, it was empty. No sign of the creature, no sign of Chet, just the blood stains and the eerie silence. They searched the area for days but found nothing. Eventually, they wrote it off as a tragic accident, a bear attack or something, but I knew better. I couldn't get those images out of my head, the creature, the altar, the sound of that drum. I tried to go back to work, tried to move on, but it was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Chet's face, heard his screams. I started having nightmares, waking up in a cold sweat, convinced that thing was still out there, watching, waiting. I quit my job, moved away, tried to start fresh somewhere else, but no matter where I went, the memories followed. I'd find myself staring into the woods, half expecting to see those black, empty eyes staring back at me. I tried talking to a few people about it, but no one believed me. They all thought it was just trauma, my mind playing tricks on me. Eventually, I stopped talking about it altogether. No one would believe me anyway, but I knew the truth. I knew that there was something out there, something ancient and evil, lurking in the shadows, and it had taken my friend. Years have passed, but I still can't shake the feeling that it's not over. I've done my best to move on, to live a normal life, but there's always that nagging fear in the back of my mind. Every now and then, I'll catch a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye, something that shouldn't be there, and I wonder if it's come back for me. Maybe one day I'll find the courage to go back to that cabin, to face whatever it is that haunts my dreams. But for now, I'll just keep trying to live my life, one day at a time, hoping that the past stays buried. This happened to me in '91. The summer the tourists were thicker than black flies in the Boundary Waters. My name's Wade Gunderson. I used to be a fishing guide up there. Knew every cove and cranny like the back of my hand. That was before my wife left me for a guy with a Lund boat and a fancy fish finder. I needed a change of pace, something less lonely than hauling bass out of the water for city slickers. Figured being a park ranger would do the trick. The first few weeks were quiet. Lost hikers, trashy campsites, the occasional bear rummaging through picnic baskets, nothing out of the ordinary for a place like the Superior National Forest. But that changed one late August afternoon, hotter than a pistol barrel in the sun, with the sky the color of bruised plums. I was out on patrol, bumping along the fire roads in my old Jeep, when I got a call on the radio. A couple of campers had stumbled across something strange near the Canadian border, something they couldn't quite explain. I made my way up there, the trees closing in like dark walls on either side, the air thick with the scent of pine needles and damp earth. The campers, a pair of college kids with more bug spray than common sense, were huddled together by their tent, their faces pale as the moon. They'd been out exploring when they came across a clearing, a patch of trampled grass and broken branches, like something big had been through there. That wasn't the weird part, though. It was the tracks. I'd seen bear tracks, moose tracks, even wolf tracks, but these were unlike anything I'd ever encountered. They were human-like, but too large, too elongated, the toes splayed out like a bird of prey's talons. The kids swore they'd heard a sound, kind of guttural growl before they hightailed it back to their campsite. I told them to pack up their gear and head back to the main road, promising to look into it. I didn't mention the cold prickle of fear crawling up my spine. I'd always thought the stories about the Wendigo, the cannibal spirit of the woods, were just campfire tales meant to scare the tourists. But standing there, staring at those tracks, I wasn't so sure anymore. The sun was starting to sink behind the trees as I followed the tracks deeper into the woods. The air grew cooler, the shadows longer, the silence broken only by the rustle of leaves and the distant call of a loon. I came to a narrow creek, the water black as ink, and there on the other side, I saw it. It was hunched over, drinking from the creek, its back turned to me. It was tall, easily 7 feet or more, covered in matted hair the color of dried moss. Its shoulders were broad, its arms long and sinewy, its legs thick and powerful. It moved with a kind of animal grace, a fluidity that belied its size. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest like a drum. I reached for my radio, but my fingers were shaking too badly to press the button. The creature lifted its head, its eyes, black, empty pits, meeting mine across the creek. A shiver ran down my spine, a cold dread that seemed to seep into my bones. I don't know how long we stood there staring at each other, but it felt like an eternity. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone, disappearing into the dense undergrowth with a swiftness that defied its size. I stumbled back to my jeep, my legs weak, my mind reeling. I radioed for backup, but by the time they arrived, the creature was long gone. We searched the area, but there was no sign of it, just the broken branches, the trampled grass, and the eerie silence of the woods. The next few days were a blur of interviews, reports, and sleepless nights. The Park Service tried to cover it up, claiming it was a bear, a moose, anything but what I knew it to be. The college kids were sent home, their story dismissed as a hallucination brought on by the stress of the wilderness. I was given a week's leave, told to get some rest, clear my head. But the memory of that creature haunted me, its eyes burning into my dreams, its guttural growl echoing in my ears. I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd seen something ancient, something primal, something that shouldn't exist in this world. I went back to the Boundary Waters, not as a ranger, but as a hunter. I spent weeks scouring the woods, following the whispers of locals, the rumors of strange sightings, the half-forgotten tales of the Wendigo. But the creature remained elusive, a shadow in the trees, a ghost in the wind. One night, as I sat by a campfire, the flames casting flickering shadows on the trees, I heard it again, the guttural growl, low and menacing, echoing through the woods. I grabbed my rifle and followed the sound, my heart pounding in my chest. I came to a clearing, bathed in the pale light of the moon, and there it was, standing in the center, its eyes glowing like embers in the darkness. It was bigger than I remembered, its muscles rippling beneath its matted hair, its claws glinting in the moonlight. I raised my rifle, my finger tightening on the trigger, but I hesitated. It wasn't fear that held me back, but a strange sense of awe, of reverence. This creature was not just an animal. It was something more, something older, something connected to the very heart of the wilderness. It turned its head, its eyes locking onto mine. I felt a wave of cold wash over me, a sense of dread that seemed to seep into my very soul. And then it lunged. I fired, the shot echoing through the woods. The creature staggered, a gurgling sound escaping its throat, but it didn't fall. It kept coming, its eyes fixed on me, its claws outstretched. I fired again and again, the recoil of the rifle jolting my shoulder, the smell of gunpowder filling the air. The creature stumbled, its movement slowing, but it wouldn't stop. It was like a machine, driven by a primal instinct, a hunger that couldn't be quenched. I ran, my lungs burning, my legs aching, the creature's growls echoing behind me. I stumbled and fell, the forest floor scraping against my skin. I rolled over, just in time to see the creature looming over me, its claws raised, its eyes burning with a feral hunger. I closed my eyes, bracing for the impact, but it never came. Instead, I heard a sickening crunch, followed by a gurgling moan. I opened my eyes to see the creature sprawled on the ground, its head twisted at an unnatural angle, its eyes staring blankly at the sky. Two Knives Johnson, a grizzled trapper who knew the woods better than anyone. He'd heard the shots and come running, his trusty Bowie knife in hand. He'd saved my life. We buried the creature in the woods, deep in the heart of the Boundary Waters, where it belonged. We didn't tell anyone what we'd seen, what we'd done. Some things are better left unsaid. Some secrets better left buried. I never went back to being a park ranger. I returned to guiding, taking tourists out on the lakes, telling them stories of the fish and the wildlife. But I never mentioned the creature, the Wendigo, the shadow in the trees. It's a secret I carry with me, a burden I bear. a reminder of the darkness that lurks beneath the surface of the wilderness. And sometimes, when I'm out on the lake, under the vast expanse of the starry sky, I can still hear its guttural growl, chilling echo from a world we can barely comprehend. My name Alexander Oakenhart, 37 years old, and this happened to me on October 21st, 1998. I've always loved camping, you know. Grew up going out into the woods with my dad and brother. It's a tradition I've kept up even though Dad's long gone and my brothers moved across the country. So when I bought this old RV, I was pretty excited to take it out for a spin. I'd planned a trip to a quiet spot in the Adirondacks, a place I'd read about but never visited. My buddy, Nolan Hayes, agreed to come along. Nolan and I had been friends since high school, so he was up for the adventure. We packed up the RV with everything we thought we'd need for a few days in the wilderness: food, beer, fishing gear, and our sense of humor. We set out early in the morning, the kind of day where the sky is clear and the air is crisp enough to feel like a promise of good times. The drive was uneventful. We joked about our wives getting a break from us and the silly things we used to do back in school. We arrived in the late afternoon. The place was perfect, quiet, a bit off the beaten path, with a small lake nearby that we set up camp, got the fire going, and cooked some burgers. As the night rolled in, we sat by the fire, drinking beer and reminiscing. It was peaceful, and the stars were out in full force. Around midnight, we decided to call it a night. Nolan crashed on the RV's couch, and I took the bed in the back. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night, feeling like I'd heard something. The kind of noise that snaps you out of sleep, but you're not sure if it was real or just part of a dream. I listened for a minute, didn't hear anything else, and figured it was just the wind or some animal. Went back to sleep. The next morning we found the campsite in a bit of a mess. The cooler was overturned, and some food was scattered around. We laughed it off, cleaned up, and decided to spend the day fishing. The lake was serene, and we caught a few fish. Things felt normal again. By the time we got back to the RV, it was getting dark. We cooked up the fish and settled in for another night by the fire. Nolan started telling ghost stories, trying to spook me. I played along, even though either of us really believed in that stuff. Later that night, I woke up again. This time, I knew I'd heard something, a low, shuffling noise outside the RV. I sat up, listening intently. There it was again, closer this time. I grabbed a flashlight and quietly moved to the front of the RV. Nolan was snoring softly on the couch. I peeked out the window but didn't see anything. I told myself it was probably just an animal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The next morning, Nolan looked at me and said, "You look like hell. Didn't sleep well?" "Yeah, I heard something last night." "Probably just an animal, but it kept me up," I replied. We decided to do some hiking and explore the area a bit. It was a good distraction, and the fresh air helped clear my head. By the time we got back, I was exhausted but felt better. We made dinner, talked about our plans for the next day, and turned in early. I woke up to a loud thud against the RV. My heart was racing and I sat up, straining to hear. Nolan was already awake, looking around nervously. I said, grabbing the flashlight and my pocket knife, we both moved cautiously to the front of the RV. I opened the door slowly and shined the flashlight outside. The beam caught something moving just beyond the light's reach. It was big, bigger than any animal I'd ever seen. "Stay inside," I whispered to Nolan, who nodded and stepped back. I stepped out of the RV, trying to get a better look. The air was cold, and the night was deathly quiet. I shined the flashlight around, but whatever it was, it had moved out of sight. The next morning, we found large, deep footprints around the RV. They were like nothing I'd ever seen before, almost human, but not quite. Nolan and I exchanged uneasy glances. What the hell made those? He asked. "I don't know, but I don't like it," I replied. "Maybe we should head back." Nolan agreed and we started packing up. The unease was palpable. As we worked, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. By the time we were ready to leave, the sun was starting to set. We decided to spend one more night, figuring we'd leave first thing in the morning. That night, I couldn't sleep at all. Every noise set me on edge. Around midnight, I heard the shuffling again, closer than ever. This time, it was accompanied by a low, guttural breathing. I nudged Nolan awake and pointed to the door. We both grabbed our flashlights and cautiously stepped outside. There, in the dim light, we saw it. A creature standing on two legs, partially hidden by the trees. It was tall, covered in matted fur, with eyes that glinted in the light. It looked almost human, but not quite. It stared at us for a moment, then turned and disappeared into the woods. Nolan and I stood there, frozen in shock. "Did you see that?" he whispered. "Yeah, I saw it," I replied, my voice trembling. "We need to get out of here now." We hurried back into the RV, locking the door behind us. Either of us slept that night. We sat in silence, listening for any signs of the creature. As soon as the first light of dawn broke, we started the RV and drove away, not looking back. We reported what we saw to the park rangers, but they didn't take us seriously. Said it was probably a bear or some other animal. But Nolan and I knew better. We'd seen something that defied explanation. I haven't been camping since. Nolan and I don't talk about it much. When we do, it's in hushed tones, like we're afraid saying too much will make it come back. I sometimes wonder if anyone else has seen it, if it's still out there, lurking in the woods. Years later, I came across a book about local folklore. It mentions sightings of a creature called the Gwaldum, said to haunt the woods and prey on those who ventured too deep. The description matched what we saw. I don't know if I believe in folklore, but I know what I saw that night, and I know I'll never go back to those woods again. Morris County, New Jersey. In early 2022, my friends and I were sitting in my car. The three of us had decided to pull over and chat as it was late on a weeknight, and we had nothing to do but eat our Wendy's and enjoy each other's company. It's important to note that my car was not on, my lights were not on, and my radio was not on, nor were any of the windows open. Suddenly, a deer appeared almost out of thin air. I had been looking in that direction the entire time, and the pond the deer appeared next to was very well lit. My immediate thought upon seeing the deer was, "Skinwalker, get out." Of course, it might not have even been one, but even just seeing the deer, I panicked. I had never been afraid of deer before, and before this moment associated them with cherished moments I spent with my grandpa during childhood. I turned to my friends and told them, "There's a deer. I think it's coming towards us." I said this before it even began to approach the car. The strange thing was, there was no reason for the deer to approach us at all. As I said earlier, we were not a disturbance, and the deer we spotted was alone. More importantly, it was a male deer with no females or babies within eyesight that it would need to protect. The deer walked about 20 to 30 feet and stood about 10 feet from my vehicle. At this point, my friends were spooked too. I noticed the deer had one missing antler, and its eyes were odd and different. The eyes were forward set on its head and looking directly at us. It looked directly at me for around 30 seconds and got into a charging position. When we tried to drive away, it started charging at my car and even chased us until the parking lot ended and became the road. The strangest part was, as we drove away much farther down the road, there were 3 male deer standing just behind the curb in a domino-like formation. The third one in the sequence was missing the same antler as the deer we encountered earlier. They did not run into the street or off into the woods. They just stood there, staring us down. I wonder if something was keeping them in that park. This happened to me in 2008, a time when the economy was tanking and I, Keaton, was tanking right along with it. Lost my job, lost my wife, Not necessarily in that order, but this thing felt about the same. So I took what little savings I had left and headed north. Figured some time in the woods might clear my head, maybe even bag a buck to fill the packed my beat-up truck with the essentials. My old Winchester, a case of Rainier, some canned beans, and a well-worn copy of Farewell to Arms. Hemingway always did have a way of making a man feel less alone. Deep in the Adirondacks, I found a secluded spot by a lake. Crystal clear water reflecting the fiery reds and oranges of the fall foliage. Set up camp, cracked a beer, and cast a line, hoping the trout were biting as well as the mosquitoes. It was the third day, dust creeping in when I heard it. A high-pitched scream that echoed through the trees, followed by a heavy thud. My heart hammered against my ribs, grabbed my rifle, instinct taking over. The scream came again, closer this time, followed by a guttural roar, something not quite human. I crept through the underbrush, the smell of pine needles and damp earth filling my nostrils. Then I saw it. A clearing bathed in the eerie glow of the moon. In the center, a hulking figure hunched over a still form. Even in the dim light, I could make out the matted hair, the torn clothes, the blood smeared across its face. It was feeding. My stomach lurched, bow rising in my throat. This was no animal. It was a man, if you could even call him that. His eyes, wild and bloodshot, met mine. A snarl escaped his lips as he lunged. I fired, the shot echoing through the night. He staggered but didn't fall. His eyes burned with a primal rage. He charged again. I dropped the empty rifle and ran like hell itself was on my heels. Branches whipped at my face, roots snagged at my feet, but I didn't stop. The guttural roar echoed behind me, spurring me on. I stumbled into my camp, grabbed my keys, and gunned the engine. The truck roared to life, headlights piercing the darkness. I careened onto the dirt road, not daring to look back. All night I drove, fueled by adrenaline and fear. When the sun finally peaked over the horizon, I pulled into a gas station, my body shaking, my mind reeling. I stumbled inside, the fluorescent lights harsh against my sleep-deprived eyes. A grizzled old man behind the counter eyed me with suspicion. I grabbed a coffee, the hot liquid scalding my tongue. It didn't matter. I needed the caffeine, needed to stay awake, needed to put as much distance between me and that thing. I spent the next few days driving, sleeping in the truck, eating gas station food. I tried to convince myself it was a nightmare, a hallucination brought on by stress and loneliness, but deep down, I knew it was real. I never went back to the woods. I found a job in a small town, kept my head down, tried to forget. But the memory of that night haunted me. The screams, the roar, the blood. It was a stain on my soul that wouldn't wash away. Years later, I read a news article about a string of disappearances in the Adirondacks. All vanished without a trace. The authorities blamed wild animals, but I knew better. It was him, the man in the woods. He was still out there, lurking in the shadows, feeding on the unsuspecting. I never told anyone what I saw. Who would believe me? A crazy story about a cannibalistic mountain man? I'd be laughed out of town, locked up in a psych ward. But I knew the truth. And the truth was a heavy burden to bear. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I still hear the screams, the guttural roar. It's a reminder of the darkness that exists in the world, a darkness I witnessed firsthand. I know I should have done something. I should have warned the authorities, tried to stop him. But fear is a powerful thing. It can paralyze you, make you run instead of fight. I live with the guilt, the regret. It's a constant companion, a shadow that follows me wherever I go. But I also live with the knowledge that I survived. I escaped the darkness, and maybe, just maybe, that's enough. They say the woods have a way of revealing a man's true nature. That night in the Adirondacks, I saw the depths of human, the darkness that lurks within us all. It was a lesson I'll never forget, a scar that will forever mark my soul. In the end, they believed me, found the remains scattered across the woods like a macabre feast, said it was a group of cannibalistic mountain men preying on lost souls who wandered too far off the trail. Never caught them, though. They vanished into the wilderness, just like their victims. But I know they're out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for their next meal. And every time I hear a scream in the night, I can't help but wonder, is it them